I've been involved in cancer for a long, long time, and I presented this talk to the A4M and then other functional societies starting in 2011, so 10 years ago. And my team actually developed a molecule to treat the tumor, okay? Treat tumors, but the tumor is not the disease. The tumor is secondary to some underlying process that causes it. And there's a number of infectious species that I'll go over that are well known and even on the American Cancer Society website that are causal agents for cancer. Not a lot of testing done in that space, but it is a real thing. And so understanding where you are on the cancer continuum is extremely important. But if you folks have already done blood testing with me, then you already have the preponderance of tests that titrate, and I won't say are absolutely specific for cancer, that have very strong association with cancer. And in fact, next week, probably, depending on who else steps forward to present, I'm going to go over what I call COVID, the jab, and cancer common biomarkers. And, excuse me. And when you go down that list, they're the major physiological markers, and they completely overlap. So cancer, if I have any take-home message from this talk today, is cancer is not some unusual disease that is unlike every other chronic disease. It fits right in to the whole spectrum of chronic diseases. And we'll go into more on that topic next week or in subsequent weeks. But today I'm just going to present what I presented to the A4M years and years ago. And I don't necessarily, say cancer is an infectious disease. Like all chronic diseases, there's multi-factorial aspects. And if infection is involved, then that isn't even the root cause. It's something else that made you susceptible to the infection, which then can drive inflammation and potentially cancer. So, that's the critical thing. When we die, we start decomposing from within. The infectious species are already there, but our microbiome, our good health, are all there to protect us. I have a lady in the program, very, very health conscious, and she took the oral DNA test. And yeah, she showed pathogen burden. Okay, we all have them. It's just a question of the degree. Where are you on that periodontal bacteria continuum? But what was interesting about her is she also did the interleukin-6 test as part of that, called the Alert 2, which looks for inflammation, and her inflammation marker was quite low, even though her infectious burden was moderate. That shows you what you can do by being healthy. You keep these things under control, if that all makes sense. So anyway, on with the show here. Let's talk about is cancer an infectious disease? And you can tell it's an old slide deck because it's in this 3x4, whatever the screen setting is, rather than the widescreen. So that dates this talk. This is functional medicine, the Academy of Functional Medicine and Genomics. It's, if you don't test, you've guessed. We've got to look below the tumor, way below, in fact, for all the multifactorial things. I'm not saying the tumor is not deadly. The tumor is growing, it's proliferating, it's shooting out blood vessels all over the place to sustain itself. That was one of the treatments designed by Judah Folkman at Children's Hospital. Didn't work very well, but the idea was a good one, that if it's rapidly growing and we can curb new vessel growth, maybe we can curb the growth of the tumor. But the tumor can envelop tissue. And if that tissue is extremely important to your health, it can be deadly. If it shuts down your pancreas, if it shuts down your liver, if it metastasizes and goes to other tissue and organs that are vital to your survival. That's the hazard of the tumor growth. Okay, and the tumor will grow independently, but it's very clear from Harvard, and I think I've shown this in the past, and I'll post this at the end of this video or even in the beginning of it, that you can control your risks. There's some really interesting videos from these researchers at Harvard, at Dana-Farber, that show that the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is a very strong prognosticator for cancer. And what the researcher talked about it is, if you can lower your neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio from a danger zone to one that's not so high up in the danger continuum, that survival increases significantly. Sadly, I don't think Dana-Farber is doing neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. I'll tell you a quick story. A friend of mine's been battling metastatic cancer for years, and about 8 years ago he invited me. He's still okay, but about 8 years ago he invited me into an oncology appointment at Dana-Farber, and I just sat there, listening, and then as the consult was ending, I asked the oncologist if he knew Jim's vitamin D level. And the response was, yeah, we measure it frequently. I said, okay, what was his latest? No response. After I left, they pulled blood, measured his vitamin D, and it was 9. Optimal is 55 to 100. Okay, they never tested it, never once, in the 10 years that he was being treated for the disease. So, the oncologist knew that vitamin D was important, but they're not testing it. So that's what we're facing in medicine, and that's why testing is so important. So from experts around the world, cancer is not a diagnosis. The tumor is not the disease. There's something underlying it. Of course, today cancer is a diagnosis, but from a root cause perspective and mechanistically, the tumor is not the disease. Something is driving the tumor. So when you go on Google Scholar or scholar.google.com, it's a good search engine into the National Library of Medicine, PubMed. And so I did some simple things like Alzheimer's, sort of my specialty, and infection. And you get 111,000 associations between these two terms. Cardiovascular disease, 1.75 million associations. Where do you think cancer is? Cancer is at the top of the list when I did this search 10 years ago. 2.4 million associations between infection and cancer. Is your oncologist even hinting at looking at this for you if you have a diagnosis? Or what we do is be proactive and test for these things that are known to titrate to cancer. Helicobacter pylori, chlamydia pneumoniae, Epstein-Barr, HPV, things of that nature. So this really goes, Dr. Harshfield, to the fundamentals of health. And Louis Pasteur, back in the mid-1800s, had 90% of the French medical budget in his laboratory. And Claude Bernard just a scant amount of dollars for his research. And at the end of the day, Louis Pasteur, among other brilliant things, forwarded the germ theory of disease. One germ, one disease. It was much more than that. They didn't give him as much credit for his understanding of the association. But Claude Bernard was the original medical scientist, in my opinion, and an MD. And he forwarded the concept of milieu interior, or terrain, or what's going on physiologically inside your body. And then Robert Koch, really was the master of determining if infectious processes were going on, the so-called Koch postulates. But even Koch said, my postulates are just that. They're not definite, definitive, and absolute. There can be variations. And so we talked about Dr. Paul Ewald in his book Plague Time, where some of these stealth inside cell intracellular infections do not adhere to Koch's postulates. So today, they're ignored as irrelevant unless Koch's postulates apply. But that's a human measurement, whereas the organism doesn't necessarily have to comply with that. So, is cancer an infectious disease? And the list is growing: cervical, HPV, gastric and esophageal, H. pylori, gallbladder, salmonella, lung, chlamydia pneumoniae, colorectal, streptococcus, pancreatic. Steve Jobs died of pancreatic cancer. Did anybody check his oral DNA? There's basically what the research shows is that your increase in risk of pancreatic cancer goes up by 50% if you have poor oral hygiene. Now, 50%, is it 0 to 50? No, it's a continuum. The worse your oral health is, the greater your risk is on that scale. Lymphomas, Epstein-Barr. What I don't have here, which should be here, is Toxoplasma Gondii. It mimics lymphoma. Sad story about a cancer patient on that, which I won't go into now. Liver, Hep B, prostate, propionibacteria, acne. So acne is an infectious disease. And there's a connection between the two. 100%? No. But it's association, something you do have potential control over because it's definable, it's detectable, it's measurable, and it's also treatable. High-risk HPV infections account for about 5% of all cancers worldwide. How do they know that? Are we testing everybody with cancer? So it's kind of like reporting in VAERS for adverse events from the vaccine. What is the real number based on reporting? So most high-risk HPV infections occur without any symptoms. These transient infections may cause cytologic abnormalities, so abnormalities to cell division, that can go away on their own. Once again, I say, are we doing enough testing to prove that they're going away on their own? This is a book that a good friend of mine wrote years and years ago, Defeat Cancer, 15 Doctors of Integrative and Naturopathic Medicine Tell You How. Okay? Why? Because the standard of care is just funneling you in to surgeries, chemotherapy, radiation, and now biologics, which are essentially immune suppressant. So let's say that process gets rid of the root cause as well as the tumor. Then you're good to go. But New York Times had a great article in the last several years that says when cancer strikes back, it strikes back much harder than the first time. And 25 to 50% have a second bout with whatever cancer they originally had. So in all four of those therapies, well, not so much the surgery, but the other pharmaceutical therapies, they actually suppress your immune system. So if you don't get it all, not the tumor, the antecedents of the tumor, no wonder why it can come back stronger than before. And how do we measure that? Pretty much everybody knows that if you have chemotherapy, your white blood cells are going to be suppressed for quite some time. And what are your white blood cells? Your innate immune system fighting infection. Okay? So there's a very strong link between the two. So this is what some of the top functional docs out there from 10 years ago were doing. We don't just do tests to determine cancers. We check the status of their immune cells, white blood cells, lymphocytes, lymphocytopenia. Guess what they're checking for in SARS? Lymphocytopenia, low lymphocyte counts. We want their immune systems to be active and balanced. We don't want elevated C-reactive protein. We don't want elevated homocysteine. We don't want elevated said rate. We don't want suppressed white blood cell counts. You know, all these standard markers. It's not unusual. There's no disease that elicits some strange response in our body. We have an innate, adaptive, and what I call a tertiary immune system. We suffer from oxidative stress. We can be metabolically, you know, the diabetes continuum, compromised. There can be tissue destruction going on in our body that's measurable. There can be clotting. There can be a whole host of things that are happening in your body that relate back to cancer. Cancer is caused by many things, including viruses, bacteria, and fungi, mycoplasmas, heavy metals, genetically engineered food, trans fatty acids, estrogen-mimicking compounds. All of these cause inflammation in the body. You know, I argue that even though they tell you there are tons of toxic substances in tobacco smoke, that the real issue is just perpetuating chronic inflammation. I do this very simple demo. Rub the back of your hand gently, but don't stop, or do it quite a lot, you know, for a long time each day. That skin will eventually be rubbed raw. You'll be inflamed. That I think is what's going on with smokers. It's an irritation more than it is a toxicity. Arguably, it's both, but you know that's part of the problem. That's why would asbestos cause cancer? It's completely inert. It's completely inert. No toxicity. But the asbestos molecule is bigger than the macrophages that are trying to encapsulate it and get rid of it. So it just stays there. And it's actually a very sharp, nasty substance that just continues in the lung to create low-grade inflammation on that tissue. Okay, so there's an example of a non-toxic substance that still elicits inflammation. Toxoplasma Gondii, yeah, I will tell the story. Dr. Tremp. Who was a better doctor than Dr. Tremp? I haven't met the person yet. With all due respect to my team members, he was just a cut above all of us. And a friend that was interested in helping us with our program had a son with HIV. And at Yale Medical School, he was diagnosed with lymphoma. Okay, swollen lymph nodes. And Dr. Tremp reviewed what was going on to the extent that he could. He didn't actually see the patient, okay, but he said Toxoplasma Gondii infection, which is an intracellular micro, as they say in Boston, a wicked small parasite gets inside cells, can inflame the lymph nodes and mimic lymphoma. What did they do with this kid, 27 years old? Chemotherapy. He was dead in 2 weeks. Okay, because he had HIV. And they further suppressed his immunity. And that's what killed him. They didn't even look for Toxoplasma Gondii. If they did, they could have treated that without immune suppressants, and he might still be alive today. That's a guess, but it's reasonable. Yeah, in Lancet, arguably the second, #2 medical journal in the world, second to the New England Journal of Medicine out of Harvard. 1/3 plus of the world is infected. Most of us don't have to worry about it because it's below detection limits. Like the lady I talked about with a periodontal disease, she has it, but there's no real response to it, so it's not an issue. It's a common parasite, reveals its strongest asset, it's stealth. You know, we wear it, the CDC, 60 million Americans have it. They vacillated, if you look at the cdc.gov/toxoplasmosis, they vacillate between 10 million, 60 million, whatever. But the point is, they say most people don't have symptoms because they have a strong immune system. But I would argue very few people are testing for Toxoplasma Gondii. We test for it, obviously. We test for it. It's challenging to treat. Okay, there's no question. All we can really do for someone with Toxoplasma Gondii at this point is help you boost your immune system. Okay, because the treatments are very aggressive, toxic, and relatively ineffective against the chronic phase of Toxoplasma Gondii. Why do we test for it then? Because it's quite prevalent, and we don't want to treat you for something else just because we're not testing for toxo if the Toxoplasma Gondii parasite is present. That could explain it. Women of childbearing age are told to stay away from kitty litter, cat feces, because that's one place where Toxoplasma Gondii can be made available to humans, matriculate. But the thing is about Toxoplasma Gondii, the key thing is it significantly impacts fetal brain development. But in adults, schizophrenia is the #1 manifestation, but mood disorders, Alzheimer's, things like that. But as I said before, Toxoplasma Gondii, excuse me, can mimic lymphoma. Okay, so is it actually causing a cancer? Not sure. Haven't researched it hard enough to know for sure. But you certainly don't want to be treated for lymphoma if you have a Toxoplasma Gondii infection inflaming your lymph nodes. Patient with progressive disease or on chemotherapy at risk for life-threatening toxo because you're suppressing immunity. That's why we have to test chemotherapy, just like looking at SARS and the VAERS, they tell you a story, but really only 1% effective. Truly 1% on an absolute scale effective at stopping the progression of cancer. And I think everybody's heard, people just dying of cancer, they've been treated, and it's just like, it's not working effectively. 1%. Okay. So we see cancer, like most chronic diseases, as a disharmony in the body, multi-factorial. Genetic abnormalities. Yeah, you can, I'm not big on genes. What do you do about it? At the end of the day, if you have a quote-unquote bad gene, it's going to express in your physiology. And you have control over your physiology. You don't have control over the genes per se. Epigenetics, yes, you do. The one that everybody worries about with Alzheimer's, the 4 allele, is protective against malaria. So there's almost nothing in our gene pool today that doesn't have some benefit. Otherwise, evolutionarily, we would have gotten rid of it because of survival. Okay? And obviously, protecting against malaria when you're 10 is much more important than protecting against Alzheimer's when you're 80. That's just the facts of life. I was told, was it you, David, Dr. Harshfield, that, no, it was that when you hit 45, 50, some of these protective genes kind of go away because you've made it past child-rearing age and so on and so forth. It's interesting. I haven't really studied that in great detail, but it's an interesting concept. It makes total sense. Dental abnormalities, intestinal flora. Boy, these folks were way ahead of their time, weren't they? Poor diet. All these cause weakening of the immune system. So, and the biggest one, the gut. Where are you on that continuum? Hard to tell. You should never have a gut symptom. Never. Okay, sure, if you eat something really raunchy or something, or you're sensitive to it, you could have diarrhea or something like that. But commonly, you should never have a routinely upset stomach or diarrhea or constipation. It should just be really what they call in medicine ectopic, very unusual. Genetic abnormalities. I read this in 2006 and it made total sense. Microbe-induced epigenetic alterations in the host cell. The coming era of patho-epigenetics of microbial infections. What this is saying is that the organism, the pathogenic organism, can hijack your DNA and change it for its benefit. So we may be interpreting your epigenetics as you, but it actually could be something even further down in the root cause spectrum. Let's see. So they say elimination of microbes inducing pathoepigenetic changes may prevent disease development. So we're never going to eliminate. That's just not going to happen. Like chlamydia pneumoniae, the one I've studied more than anything, the oral pathogens I think are more prolific, but the way they measure whether you're positive for something like chlamydia pneumoniae is they take your raw blood and they check for the antibody. Then they dilute it, check again, dilute it again, check again. And if after 6 dilutions antibodies are still present, they consider you positive. But if it's only present after 6 dilutions, they consider you negative. Point is, we all have these organisms. It's war down there, and we just have to have a stronger military, stronger immune military to fight these things. If you've heard me talk about any other disease, sound the same, right? Sounds very, very, very much the same. Gus Castanes, a really good friend of mine, passed away last year, or maybe early this year. Cancer results from changes in epigenetic expression, which gets altered by environment. Sure it does. Because poor nutrition, stress, immune dysfunction, they all tie back to opportunistic infections. So, very good point. Change in the body's internal terrain, poor immune system, nutrient deficiencies, inflammation, and oxidative stress. First, I want to talk about oxidative stress. There is no question that the oxidative stress markers, elevated ferritin, haptoglobin, things of that nature, myeloperoxidase, are definitely elevated, and I'll show this next time we talk cancer, in cancer patients. In fact, I changed my whole algorithm. I don't want to say change it. I've updated my cancer 0 to 10 score on the chronic disease temperature and this new cancer program we're launching based on cancer patients with, end stage 4 cancer, things of that nature. Because ferritin in all of them was off the charts. So 1,000, 1,500, 2,500. Severe oxidative stress. Very easily measurable. Mercola wants you to be below 100. I think that's reasonable, somewhere between 40 and 100. I'm not saying 30 is bad. It all depends on your whole iron balance and your iron uptake and any number of other iron parameters. So having a low ferritin isn't necessarily bad. It just may say you're not absorbing iron extraordinarily well, so you're not storing as much, or you have plenty of iron around and the brain says that's adequate, and it lets the kidneys just excrete it. C-reactive protein, sedimentation rate, all these high levels of inflammation are associated with poor long-term treatment outcomes, no question. Neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. Like I said, I'll put those 2 Harvard videos at the end of this presentation when I produce it. Infection in the sinuses, mouth, and tonsils can cause immune problems and compromise recovery from cancer. So there's 2 ends of the scale. There's prevention, there's measuring if you're at risk, and there's prognosis, putting odds in your favor if you have a diagnosis of cancer for better survival, better outcomes. The markers are exactly the same. Okay, it's just a question of where you are on that cancer continuum that's going to make the difference. Okay, so that's why the devil's in the detail, running the markers. And so, in our cancer algorithm, we have 21 biomarkers for the chronic disease temperature that we really use. And there are about 30 to 35 in the cancer algorithm with a main focus on tissue destruction markers and the oxidative stress markers, a broader array of oxidative stress markers beyond our usual markers of immune health, inflammation. A lot of you have got the infectious panel So we already have quite a bit of coverage with our chronic disease temperature. Julian Kenyon, I consulted Julian. He's over at the Dove Clinic in the UK. And he uses a therapy that I helped develop with a couple really bright MDs at Harvard. And unfortunately, the product is now made in China. The Chinese ripped it off, but that's an old story, right? But in England, the longest lived was the mid-Victorian working class. They ate well. They were outside grounding. They grew their own vegetables. They raised their own chickens. They physically labored. All the things that the average American today does not do for any variety of reasons, particularly convenience. But so cancer was 10% compared to today, macro and micronutrients, where I believe he said something like 6 times higher than we have today. You know, you constantly have to be replenishing those water-soluble nutrients. That's why I'm bullish on that fulvic-humic blend. Okay, derived from the soil, all the micronutrients. I think we all could afford to take in some liquid nutrients. So suggested reading, look up Paul Clayton. Nutritional and anti-inflammation. This is what Dr. Kenyon does. And then he does what's called activated therapy, and I'll go into that in a minute. It's really interesting. So here's the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. I've known about this for way too long. And of course, we calculate it. It's very simple. Complete blood count with differential. You get your total white blood cell count, but then you have the absolute neutrophils, not the percent. The absolute neutrophils divided by the absolute lymphocytes. Once again, on the report, you'll see both percent and ABS. ABS stands for absolute. It's the absolute neutrophils divided by the absolute lymphocytes. And you want to be between 0.6 and 1.5. You're in real danger of a poor cancer prognosis above 4. Okay, so here's an example. OS, overall survival, for the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. And so you can see less than 3, better odds, greater than or equal to 3, really bad odds. But do you really want to be on this continuum here? I think you want to be up here with your neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio between 0.6 and 1.5. So I'll get into this therapy, and this was actually published around 2000 by National Geographic. Pigments that turn caustic on exposure to light can fight cancer, blindness, and heart disease. Their light-induced toxicity may also help explain the origin of vampire tales. Only Scientific American would be that provocative. Let me explain what this therapy is and what the next level is. And there are clinicians in Mexico, Julian Kenyon in England, Australia, China, Japan, South Africa, and the US that do this therapy. Okay, it's a very specialized therapy, but basically here's Tom Kerber, an expert on high-intensity infrared and visible light. So PDT is photodynamic therapy. It's cancer therapy using red light to enhance the cytotoxic effects of drugs known as photosensitizers. So how this works is you take in this drug, and there's a number of them out there that are used. Even the Cancer Centers of America was doing PDT. The drugs they have are antiquated, but they still list photodynamic therapy on their website. This is not a fringe treatment. But what they do is you take in the drug, either IV or sublingually or maybe even through the gut, and the drug concentrates in the tumor by design. How does it do that? Well, the tumor is rapidly growing cells. So it's a hog for energy. So what they've done is design the molecule to look a little bit like sugar. Then they let it sit for a while, maybe a day or two, and you get rid of all the PDT sensitizer, except those in areas where it's concentrated with so-called hyperproliferating or rapidly growing tissue. Then you shine light on it, and what it does is it produces peroxide, or ozone, if you will. So rather than doing ozone whole body, it goes specifically into the tissue, shine light on it, and boom, it creates that free radical, ozone, peroxide, whatever you want to call it. It's all in the same family. And that basically burns up, if you will, oxidizes the membrane of the cancer tissue. Is it perfect? No. You know, if we could, with a microneedle, put it in every little tumor cell in the body, then maybe we'll have more success. But also it's subject to the permeability of your body to the light. And even though we see the light shining through Dr. Kerber's hand, you know, it may only be able to penetrate down to a centimeter, maybe a couple centimeters in most instances at its best. But what I was privileged to work on was the next level, which uses sound to also activate the agent. And Nostradamus predicted that sound waves would kill tumors. Ultrasound, but maybe he didn't know this spin we had on it, but maybe he did. But he said in a famous quote, "After assessment gives the unique frequency, like a tuning fork, where everything has its frequency which it's harmonic with, okay, which it vibrates with. And if you have a high enough intensity, that vibration can be very detrimental, okay? The unique frequency to operate on patients, waves of sound kill the cancers. They become lifeless and the poisons leave the body. Because your immune system then picks up on it, that it's, you know, it's garbage now. It's like when you kill bacteria or a virus with an antiviral or anti-infective. You feel crappy. That's your immune system responding to something that it heretofore really didn't appreciate well and didn't scout after and try to kill on its own. It was evading your immune response. So in this case, you know, it's another die-off reaction, if you will. So there's good old Nostradamus. Here's another picture from Scientific American that basically just shows these are porphyrin molecules. The key thing about them is they absorb light like crazy. So if you see a bleached color, some light's hitting that color, but it's not absorbing it. Whereas these molecules, every little photon that hits it gets absorbed. And more importantly, rather than emitting light, it emits an electrical response. I won't go into that right now, but I actually did a substantial amount of work in the 1970s as an undergraduate on this concept. So activated cancer therapy, a paradigm shift. I tried to get this approved, but it's very complex. You get the molecule and you have the energy source, so it's two different things. And I'm just not very good at going out and selling myself to investors to do this stuff, but it is being used around the world to a small extent. But basically, the molecules look very much like chlorophyll. What does chlorophyll do? It's the green in every plant. Sunlight hits it, and chlorophyll affects the transformation from carbon dioxide gas to the fixation of it in terms of plant structure. Carbohydrates, if you will. So the molecules are very, very similar, affected by light, but with the right intensity, affected by sound. Now here's some work we did with a Chinese colleague on this in a hospital where they had he was a 4-star general in the PLA, People's Liberation Army. He had a lot more latitude to work on this. But he basically showed that tumor volume, okay, date after treatment. And the interesting thing is, with the sensitizer and ultrasound, that we see treatment ended right around day 2, we saw a lasting effect on tumor size. And here's just an image, a fluorescent image of tumor. And, all I'll tell you here is that in mice cultures, the tumor went down. Really interesting aspect of this therapy is that sometimes the molecule will absorb energy and then luminesce at a different frequency called the redshift. But you could literally see the luminescence through tissue. So it's called Photodynamic Diagnostic. I believe that's what it was called. And this was done by Dr. Doug Mitchell in Australia. And here are some results that Dr. Kenyon published. Basically, survival, predicted median survival across a whole host of cancer patients. Once again, it's not a miracle treatment. The thing is, just like chemo, just like radiation, are we getting to all the cancer cells in terms of the treatment? And it is expensive. So, a lot of people might do one round of therapy where they really should be doing a year's worth. And a round takes about 2 weeks. So, breast cancer, actual survival, predicted survival, alive and exceeding predicted median. Dr. Kenyon has published more papers on his clinical results recently, within the last year. I have a bunch of the papers. I'll probably put them up there when I produce this. I'll put up some of the papers that were published on this in our blog. So my conclusion is cancer is at least in part infectious disease. Call to action is differential diagnosis. Really, it's differential diagnosis is not even done in all it means is, looking in multiple facets of disease causation. Okay, but really it's just looking at root cause and looking at disease as being multifactorial. We want to honor Claude Bernard, and Hippocrates says, I'll prevent disease wherever I can, whenever I can. And really, my last slide here for today is cancer is like an iceberg. Okay, that's the tumor. But this is all the multifactorial things that can be behind the tumor that basically is being ignored. Even, we're going to be presenting, I hope, through Tom Lockensgaard at the Truth About Cancer Live. But I've been pounding on Ty for a couple of years now. It's like, Ty, you're sending patients worldwide to best of breed, quote, alternative cancer therapy. Let's do screening for people. Let's understand their risk. And what Dr. Harshfield always talks about, let's do prehab or pre-treatment with these people before they go and spend 40 grand at Tony Jimenez's clinic, Hope for Cancer in Tijuana. Because there's only one thing that can come from that. If we improve your biomarkers, you're much more likely to have a better outcome. And with that, so I want everybody to do one thing. I need to be reincarnated so I can work on some of this stuff. I'm getting too old to try to fight the system and and go after some of these technologies. But there are plenty of good technologies out there. Let's see some of the questions we have. Something about the consciousness. Are the inflammation tests ever within normal limits and still have cancer? Frank, I can't answer that. Once the tumor is developing, maybe you can bring those markers down, but the tumor is still there. Will it proliferate as much? Not sure. But I will tell you, but see, Dana-Farber is only focusing on treatment. Dana-Farber says if you bring the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio down, that it significantly enhances overall survival when tied to their biological therapy. No one is studying this without therapy. There's no clinical trials on this. No one does a clinical trial unless because they're so expensive, without having the opportunity to make billions with the drug. So it's all a guess, but I can tell you, if you don't move yourself down that continuum, you're not going to be as well off as you would be if you do move yourself down the continuum. Any known infections associated with uterine fibroids? I don't think I'm skilled to answer that question. I haven't looked, against all the tumors, all the cancers and infectious species that can cause them. But I'm of the ilk. Charles Mayo forwarded the concept of focal or localized infection. And something like chlamydia pneumoniae can cause arthritis, dementia, lung cancer, same organism. Okay? So it's not to say that it couldn't find its way into other tissue and have an inflammatory impact on that could lead to cancer. But to answer the question specifically, I don't know the answer to that one. Let's see.
Dr. Lewis, the uterine leiomyoma question is interesting. If you consider the ischemic aspect of these so-called fibroids, they're not even fibrous tissue, by the way. They're smooth muscle. And there's so much bacteria, microbiome in the uterus and the vaginal tract and birth canal. And that a lot of this happens from the endothelium is sick. The part of the uterus is becoming starved, ischemic. So if you've got these little bacteria around, then you absolutely can kind of knock over the immune system. Not to make it too complicated, but I think your whole presentation is to stay focused on the innate immune system and all the things that can put that in disequilibrium, from trauma to toxins to infection. All those things can alter your immune system. The other thing too, Thomas, is that I think that we need to upgrade our understanding of our innate immune system from its 70 years old 1950s model of a two-box system. The front end is where the antigen comes in. Your innate immune system, the one that you're talking about in these conferences, is the immediate system, seconds to 72 hours maybe. It's got a certain number of cells like macrophages, neutrophils, and things that sort of are non-specific. But they know this is not me, and so I'm going to put up a defense against it. Meantime, the second box is that adaptive system that we're fooling around with, the vaccines and so forth. But eventually the innate system sends some information over to the adaptive system, B cells and T cells, and says, hey, make some T killer cells. We need some real specific fighters, and then make some antibodies to whatever these antigens are. So that two-box system has kind of been going on for a long time. And now that this vaccine is finally brought to light, people go, wait a second, what's missing here? There's a third box in between the innate and the adaptive systems called the interferon system that refines this discussion. And then on the very top is the neural plasticity, the neural system. And then on the bottom is the gut. So those 5 little boxes are in orchestration. And not to make it too complicated again. So I like the fact that the innate system is the front end. And these other little guys of the immune system are important, but the innate is the most important. And that if you don't have that, the uterine fibroids and so forth, cancers and so forth, are going to pretty much do what they want. You can put vaccines in the tailpipe of this thing, the adaptive system, but it doesn't engage the innate system. Right. There is a memory that occurs with neural inflammation, infection, and gut inflammation. But all those 5 compartments need to be involved. And I think that's the problem with just trying to use a vaccine for something, is that you're not really giving the entire system the picture of the problem.
Oh, absolutely not. And Dr. Harshfield, I wrote a short book on chronic inflammation and hidden infections. And what I talked about there is how important plaques really are. What's in plaques? They're antimicrobial.
Sounded really good.
Antimicrobial peptides. Oops. And so antimicrobial peptides are amyloids. They've been demonized, but they're actually part of the immune response. Cholesterol. If you're on cholesterol drugs, this is, the AIDS study back in the 1980s, 90s. Those are the people who died from AIDS, who are on cholesterol treatment or had low cholesterol. That molecule is building new membranes of healthy cells. And so if you want to lose the battle with cancer, just have deterioration without rebuilding capacity. That's why cholesterol is an extraordinarily important molecule in fighting cancer. But I really appreciate that, Dr. Harshfield. And anytime you want to present in more detail on these topics, feel free. The Rife machine, good for fighting cancer. Well, I think that's all about electricity. Creating the right microelectric environment and pH in your body. Cancer doesn't grow well in slightly basic, slightly high pH environments. It grows very well in acidic environments. Don't get that confused with your gut. You need super strong acid to absorb minerals to create the buffering balance to keep your blood alkaline to prevent cancer. Lasers for photodynamic therapy. So it's going to vary with the agent. The agent that I was involved with has a absorption peak at 636 nanometers, visible light, red light. 660 is the more common one. Is that protoporphyrin 9 or something? 5 ALA. I can't remember the exact sensitizers that have been out there for a long time. But infrared light's extremely important for health in general. So I know a good source of infrared light. David, any idea? Good source? Maybe the sun?
No kidding. Walk around barefoot with an umbrella drink and hang around outside, relax a little bit. Those energies, Thomas, you were talking about, the ultrasound is a mechanical mechanism that vibrates and sets up an energy. I guess it's almost kind of a response, sort of. The infrared light and all the electromagnetic spectrum, including radiation therapy, that's way too high a volume of energy. We're just trying to get electrons in the cell. However you can do that, the Rife system, the Rasha system, all these things are on a frequency, the beauty of which, if your cells, the healthy cells, remember we talked about minus 25 millivolts, that's our magic number, which makes our pH neutral at 7.4. And when the pH starts to drop, the voltage drops to minus 20, minus 15, 0, plus 30. Cancer loves that. So if we can get electrons in the cell, however, that can be done by eating, by getting more sleep, by walking barefoot in the sun. All those sorts of
taking the liquid minerals.
Yeah.
Let me give you this is 2.0 in terms of science, but you brought it up, David. How does sound trigger a response that's electrical in a molecule? And, David Dolphin, who's one of the gurus on PDT, and I had a conversation. He said, I don't believe that ultrasound can do this. But Peter Rees from the NIH published a lot on this. And what we believe is happening is that you create this microbubble and there's a cavitation and it releases enough heat or enough photons. And the key thing about the molecules that do this work is they will capture a single photon and produce a reactive oxygen species, an electron, if you will. So, to your point, so I really think it makes sense. And the data that we have from China, from England, from Australia, from South Africa, is that it shrinks tumors. And I believe it also kills infection. I know someone who's looking at this technology to treat Lyme disease. So, has anyone looked at the elevated ferritin with COVID and cancer incidence? It's out there. There's no question the Chinese showed that ferritin goes crazy in the early COVID-19 patients in Wuhan. And my data, I don't have a huge N number, in other words, not thousands of patients. But I had one lady, and her metabolic profile was perfect. And a lot of people say, high insulin, high sugar drives cancer, energy hog, all that. Her metabolic profile was better than anybody listening. And I'm saying that as a fact because it just was. It was amazing. Her fasting insulin, fasting glucose, and A1C. Yet, stage 4 breast cancer. But her ferritin and her oxidative stress markers were off the chart. 1,500, 2,500 kind of thing. I received your... okay, that's a... Diana, I'll call you. After listening today, it seems that having a blood test and you're doing the biomarkers would be the best first step before a mammogram or thermography or an addition. Well, I want to say that no testing system is perfect. But what we're endeavoring to do is expand the breadth of biomarkers that tell you about your physiological health and risk. Can a tumor sneak in on you? Focal infection, focal inflammation, and have a small tumor develop? Yes, I wouldn't discourage anybody from some of these tests. I may not be a big fan of them, but I think, detecting screening for tumor is not an unreasonable thing. I personally will never get screened for a tumor ever, but I will screen myself on my own labs and make sure I'm going in the right direction. And have a good lunch like I had, shrimp with turmeric and sweet potato with lots of butter. Rife is about MOR, oscillatory rate, and harmonics. Light years ahead of his time. So much being suppressed by mainstream disease management. Hey, chemotherapy is one of the most lucrative prescriptions by a doctor. So what can you say? What do you think of the Garrison therapy? Is it Garrison? But Dr. Harshfield, do you want to comment on Rife is about MOR, oscillatory rate, and harmonics, light years ahead of his time?
It's about frequency. And I think if you look at the human body when we're trying to make these measurements, that we're looking at different things like the vibrational frequency. It's like 78 megahertz from the top of your head to about 68. If it gets lower than that, it's cancer loves that. So, and then the frequency just tells you how many cycles per second. And the higher the frequency of light, the more energy it has. And longer frequency, like radio waves don't have as much energy, but they travel and penetrate. And the whole idea is to find the resonant frequency in the discussions. Like in my guitars, if I have a guitar in the other room in there and I pluck the C string in this room, that C string will vibrate, not the other strings. So each of us has our own frequency. The liver we know is about 400, 490 or so. And if you're trying to put energy in, it needs to be at 490 a nanometer wavelength, not 520 or 380. That's why these broad bandwidth things like the Morse system, the Rife system, it is like, it puts everything in from 650 to 300. And by the time it goes through the skin, to the sub-Q fat, capsule liver, by the time some of that gets to the liver cells that need to vibrate at 490, it will have a resonant frequency that will vibrate. And the beauty of those Rife systems is that whatever you don't need goes through, goes on by. The cold laser, the lower infrared spectrum, that tends to be very supportive and puts energy in the tissues, but it's not very deep, as Dr. Lewis just commented on. So there's a lot of these toys out there that are wonderful. We got to be careful, like we talked about, the poisons in the dose. Some of this radiation, visible light is okay, infrared, low infrared is okay, but you start getting to be up in the ultraviolet and the X-ray and gamma radiation, that's destructive. We have to be really careful with that. And we use radio frequency, the very lowest frequency of light, to make MRI pictures. So everything's vibrating with the energy that we're putting in you, whether it's
right.
light, ultrasound, and so forth. So we need to be careful with the things that we do. And the Rife systems and those that have been known about for almost a century. It may be more. We've known about this vibrational information. It's harmless. The worst thing it can do is nothing.
Waves versus particles, Dr. Harshfield. It's a very simple energy equation. E, energy, equals h nu. H equals Planck's constant, and nu equals the frequency of the light energy. So, very simple.
The confusing part of it, if there's no observer, this is the crazy thing about quantum physics versus relative. The theory of relativity is about big things, planets and stuff. And quantum physics is about these Planck's constants and things, and we can't get them to talk. We need a theory of everything. We're going to eventually figure it out. But here's the other thing. If there's no observer with the quantum physics, these little particles can be anywhere in the universe. But once you have an observer, then it changes and it becomes a particle. It has to behave here, it has to be here, it has to work this way. Isn't that interesting? I mean, that's sort of the esoteric. But if you look at the link about consciousness, I think you'll find it a nice tag.
And I just made a mistake there. I said equals h nu. It's the frequency, not the wavelength. The frequency. Correct? The shorter the frequency, the higher the energy.
Mm-hmm. And without energy, guys, we're at room temperature. We don't want to be at equilibrium.
Exactly. Anyway, thoughts on stem cells, and then we'll close.
Stem cells
maybe related to cancer.
Yes, they can be anything they want to be. The interesting thing, when you're looking at salamanders and these planaria and so forth, they can regenerate in ways that we're not capable of. The key to it is not the amazing fact that they can regenerate a limb or extremity or organ, but that stops. And that's where the most of the research. Michael Levin at Tufts University is the one's doing most of this work. And he can cut off the head and the tail of a planarium and then put it in an electric field. We were just talking about electricity. And that electric field will dictate that it grows back two heads. That is not in the little planarium's DNA. It was in this bioelectric field. So there's something affecting us besides our God-given genetic. Stem cells grow when you chop the little head of the planarium off. They all grow right to the edge of the amputation, but they don't know what to do. They don't know whether to become an eyeball or whatnot. That bioelectric field contains this invisible, non-physical instruction as to what to generate. The biggest question now is what makes a stem cell become cancerous and so forth. And what Michael's concept now is that cells in general, human bodies are a big cellular collective. Back when we were single bacteria, life was fun. We were single. We were out. We could do whatever we want to, stay up all night. Once we decided to live together as a trillion of cells that make up the human body, then we got to live next door to each other. And we got to have this bioelectric field tells us, I'm going to be a finger or I'm going to be an eyeball. These stem cells somehow disassociate themselves. So they're not only not talking to their neighbors, they're not paying attention to the bioelectric field. And their pH changes and so forth. And then they're really smart. They start grabbing your platelets and hiding the surface antigens. They put a lot of sugar, sialic acid on the surface so they taste sweet to the killer cells. Mm-hmm. It's really phenomenal. But a lot of this research, back to the electrical fields and so forth, if you can put another electrical field and change those ions in the cancer cells, they'll either undergo apoptosis, meaning programmed death, or B, they'll behave. And, if you've got a cancer, it's not metastasizing. As long as it's spot and keep an eye on it, it's benign, like that fibroid we were talking about a minute ago. So there's a whole lot of information. Stem cells do not cause cancer. They don't change your DNA. But cancer also uses the same equipment to be bad that our cell therapy does to make you better. So you just have to keep an eye on these sorts of things. And again, we're not doing things that create more trouble. The worst thing happens, they don't work. And that's why Dr. Lewis and I are working together. My patients that didn't get better, they didn't have thyroid dysfunction. They didn't have a gut that wasn't leaking. Once Thomas fixed those things, suddenly the knee pain got better. So it's a multi-system approach. The focus is simple. It's the innate immune system, the innate immune system.
All right, folks. We'll be doing this tomorrow, 8 p.m. Eastern, or a redo, same topic. We hit some complicated subjects, so if you want to hear again, but we will publish this. This, I think, can go out on YouTube. So thank you very much for your time.
Have a good week.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dr.
Fran.
Lewis.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Very informative.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.